Hi, Dan. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us again.
Well, thank you for having me back. Pleasure to be here.
Indeed. Then welcome back. Super happy to have you. What exciting conversation ahead. So many people have signed up for this session. Um, it's somehow on everyone's mind now. Those who are working on the intersection of different climate policy angles in Europe. So, where should we get started? I'm thinking, can you just give us a few sentences on where is CBAM today and what is the immediate outlook before we start drilling into the big topic of today?
Yes. Well, I'm a trader, so I'd say the outlook is bullish. We're looking at the European Commission doubling down in lots of ways to the EU CBAM. Some of the rhetoric out of the Commission is a bit negative on fertilizer. Happy to get into that, but broadly speaking, CBAM itself is very much flourishing. We are seeing probably the best sign of CBAM, which is the wider impact in the geopolitical sphere. So we are seeing many third countries incorporating costs of carbon in response to CBAM, right, which is one of the main goals of the regime. And so broadly speaking, CBAM is seen as having its mark already. On January 6th, actually, the Commission came out with a quite bullish post saying CBAM is a success. Some might say the jury's still out to decide that or not, but nevertheless, the Commission itself is quite happy.
Well, it's a bit early to call it a success, I would say. But one thing that
I'd say so too.
One thing maybe to pick up on, you wrote a post a couple of days ago that went quite viral on the Yara investment, right, in Louisiana. And for me, that was so interesting. And that's probably why it resonated with so many people. And basically how an $8 billion investment into an ammonia facility in Louisiana hinged on the CBAM continuing as planned, especially when it comes to fertilizers. Now, a lot to unpack there, and I'd love to talk to you, to ask you basically, why is everyone talking about fertilizer right now? But also, just as a side note, so interesting, right? How a huge billion-dollar investment in the US right now hinges on Europe sticking to its environmental policy.
And Yara's
That's
far
an interesting
from the
story.
only. Yeah, it's. I mean, within our portfolio of clients, we're speaking with a number of clients who are looking at some significant investments, billions of euros based on the CBAM as well as the EU ETS. I mean, if we look at the idea behind these costs of carbon, they're giving companies a pricing signal to abate, right? And they need that pricing signal to justify these projects, right? You look at a lot of the fuel switching done in the power sector. One could argue that one of the main business cases is that that cost of carbon. In a lot of ways, coal and lignite, for example, hard to produce when you're paying a 90 euro cost of carbon for power. And so industry is looking ahead, just like power is, looking at creating profitable business cases based on these costs of carbon, which is pretty cool. That's what the CBAM and the EU ETS are supposed to do, incentivize abatement. Well, I'm sure in removals you see similar ideas too, right? A project developer is creating a carbon removal project based on a pricing signal long-term payout, and so it's using the idea of capitalism to hopefully solve climate change. And so I think we're both playing in the same sandbox, just I guess different parts of it.
They're changing the sandbox right now. That's the problem, right? No, and this is, I just saw that, for example, the EPP, they just, biggest party in the European Parliament, right? They just had their meeting in Zagreb, Croatia, and they spoke very openly about wanting to change the ETS and the CBAM to keep European industry competitive. And I know that the big topic there right now, they're very honed in on fertilizers right now, but this is the big issue, right? Like as you said in your post, if you don't have that predictability, the sandbox doesn't exist anymore because you don't know what's happening to it.
And I'm not going to touch on politics because I'm sure I get slapped on the wrist from my superiors. But broadly speaking, we've seen rhetoric out of various member states for years. I believe Poland, I believe, is one of the main factors. I think nearly every year for the last, I think, 6 consecutive years, they've been looking to dismantle the EU ETS. I could name maybe 4 or 5 other member states, and understandably so. I mean, looking at Eastern European, it's very much coal oriented, and naturally it's going to be very expensive for EU ETS or EU CBAM, and so completely understandable why they're looking at dismantling them. And from a lot of these countries' perspectives, CBAM might not be very good. But again, that's why CBAM exists. It gives them an incentive to decarbonize, and decarbonizing can be quite expensive. So completely understand why some countries are opposed to it.
Well, let's dig into the big question of the day, because we wanted to talk about international credits. There was a commission review report that was published back in December, and both Sebastian and I got quite a bit of inbounding messaging on one specific paragraph in it, which is about the upcoming implementing act that is setting the rules on the deduction of carbon price paid in a third country.
Yep.
And how that works. And on this specifically, it says that the European Commission will work on the principle of equivalence and will clarify how claims for carbon credits purchased under compliance schemes can be taken into account, including those under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. That came as something quite unexpected, because we've had discussions about the 2040 climate targets and the final text that was agreed on the climate law and the international credits there. But there, everything is, 2036
Yep.
and beyond typically. And suddenly, bam, here is CBAM, and
CBAM.
international credits seem to be coming in to play way earlier.
Yep.
What's happening?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So from context to everyone watching, Evie's mentioning on December 17th the proposed CBAM expansion, and in that there's exactly 2 sentences actually that touch on Paris agreements under CBAM. And so here's a general overview of what this actually means. Typically, when we talk with clients in the realm of the VCM with CBAM, naturally everyone, what they want to do is not pay a CBAM certificate that's around 86 euros, quite expensive. They'd rather buy an offset, or in this case an Article 6 credit, right? That might be 10, 20, 30 euros. Naturally, the Commission's always had a very clear stance that's not going to fly under the EU CBAM. But what might fly is something called an effective cost of carbon. So the way CBAM works, understandably, is that if a good has already been exposed to a cost of carbon, let's say a carbon tax or an ETS, then the Commission might consider giving a rebate to that exposed party that paid the CBAM price. So in principle, it's just not being double taxed twice. So the main takeaway is there will never be a scenario where a company avoids the CBAM price. The question really is, who do they pay that price to? So I know that could be quite a lot of carbon jargon, so I'll make it very simple example here. Let's say I'm India, okay? I'm the Indian government, and Tata Steel, one of the largest Indian steel producers, they come to me and they say, "Hey Dan, we really rely on the European market. We want to keep exporting to Europe, but because of the CBAM, maybe my price per steel goes up by 200 or 300 euros per ton, which is quite expensive. It's maybe 40%, 50% of the entire cost of the good. Under the CBAM, if I, India, tax, let's say Tata Steel within India via a carbon tax or an emissions trading system, and I can prove that they've already been exposed to this rigorous and equal cost compared to the EU ETS, well then Tata could justifiably get a rebate under the EU CBAM. So that's the general premise we're going to work with, okay? And so where this new clause comes in, it says if India, you have a cost of carbon that's effective and equal, and if in that cost of carbon you allocate a certain amount of the shortfall exposure to, let's say, using Article 6 credits, then, and only under a mandatory regime like that, would the European Commission consider giving that a rebate under the EU CBAM. So to be very clear, what we're not saying is that company in India can't voluntarily just buy an offset. Doesn't matter if it's a 300 euro removal, an Article 6 credits, a CDM project, doesn't matter. It's only in a regime that's mandated, such as a carbon tax or an emissions trading system, that then the Commission could even consider giving it a rebate. And only then would they look at other attributes. Is it equal? Is it, is it effective? Is it net of free allocation? You go down this list. And so if I know I was speaking Carbonese there, if anyone's still with me, the main takeaway is this. A cost of carbon under CBAM could be given, and I want to emphasize, could be given only under a mandatory regime.
So obviously mandatory is one clear message, right? It has to be mandatory. The other one is the principle of equivalence. You mentioned a lot here, equal kind of carbon pricing. What does it mean? Does it mean equal in terms of, the price per ton compared to what is the EUA price, or whether there is a CO2 impact that is equivalent? Because this is where we come into the price arbitrage, right?
Yep. A very simple experiment to think about is let's say you make 1 ton of cement in Europe, right? If I take, let's say, Poland, some of our clients, around 40 to maybe 30% of their entire cost of cement production in Poland is cost of carbon. Very expensive. Okay, so that's the effective cost in Europe. And understandably, a fair system under CBAM would mean if I'm Çimsa in Turkey, exporting my cement or clinker into Europe, I would have to be exposed to a similar robust cost that, let's say, CEMEX in Poland is. And so on that basis, it has to be an exposure that is equal. Realistically, it's going to be an emissions trading system or a carbon tax. That's point one. In that system, that ETS or carbon tax, it has to be net of free allocation. It's really easy for, let's say, Turkey or India. I don't want to pick on a country, but let's say I'm a country and I incorporate a carbon tax of, let's say, 100 euros per ton. But let's say I use free allocation and I subsidize that entire 100 cost. Realistically, it's not an effective cost at all. So what you need to look at is truly what is the makeup of that product, the effective cost of it. And if you take that understanding, there's actually very limited amount of jurisdictions in the world that have an effective cost. I always say, and I'll still say this, there's only really one sector I could ever think about that's truly, completely exposed to a cost of carbon that doesn't have to pay CBAM. Technically still pays CBAM, but just gets rebated, and that's UK power exports. Because you have a UKA price of, let's say, £63. On top of that, you have a CPS price of, I think it's £18. So realistically, that is really expensive cost of carbon, and that's really only one jurisdiction I can think of, because free allocation in UK ETS doesn't happen for power. And so,
can we drill down on that? Because, and I also see that Fabiola also posted that in the comments on the live. The cost difference here, because you used the example of India earlier. Like, let's imagine that India plays ball and they have this all set up, but you can essentially buy carbon credits in the in Indian ETS for 10, 20, 30 euros, whatever it ends up being. You don't have the equivalency. So how would it work for any ETS in the world, basically, that's not the UK? And even there, it's tricky, right?
In India, let's say I had a cost of carbon of, let's say, $10 per carbon credit, because they're doing the carbon credit system, not a traditional ETS. In the EU ETS, the CBAM certificate right now is 86 euros. So I would need enough carbon credits in the Indian regime, if it's even approved under the EU ETS, to reach that 89 euro, let's say, threshold to meet that equivalence. So it's not on a per ton basis; it's on a euro amount or an exposure amount. I always say, how much money is leaving the bank account of the exposed party? That's what Europe is measuring, not the how many tons are you buying. Because theoretically, and I work with some very sophisticated clients, they just buy a $6 cheap CDM credit. That's 1 ton, and try and make a case that they've already paid a cost of carbon. Europe says no, and understandably so, because if I'm ThyssenKrupp, if I'm ArcelorMittal, if I'm any of the EU ETS exposed installations, I don't have the opportunity to buy an offset. I can only buy an EUA. An EUA right now is probably more like 83 euros per ton, and so therefore that equivalence comes from a pricing perspective.
So, yeah, on this pricing perspective, because when I'm reading the text, just mentions the principle of equivalence, My impression was that, well, now we really need to understand what it means in practice. But when I'm listening to you, it sounds like, well, this has all been worked out. So where does this specific interpretation come from that you're presenting here?
Article 9 of the EU CBAM. So there's various articles within the CBAM legislation. Article 9, you can control F it in the document, is the effective cost of carbon. The effective cost of carbon lays out the various principles that the European Commission would be using to deem an effective cost of carbon. Now, typical European Commission, they give you the ambiguous guardrails of the article, but they say an implementing act will follow with further details. That implementing act we're expecting in 2026, so more information to clarify. But the overall principles behind the CBAM deducted is Article 9 of the EU CBAM legislation. Yeah.
So this specific implementing act that is expected, that will clarify also how these claims can happen with international credits or used under compliance schemes.
Yep.
So that is what we're expecting this year, 2026.
Yep, and I mean, broadly speaking, we have a pretty good understanding of what costs of carbon would be applicable and what would not. The European Commission is fairly clear within the guide rules. It has to be a mandatory cost, so it cannot be voluntary. It has to be equal. That's Article 1 of the EU CBAM. CBAM is supposed to mirror the EU ETS, so it has to be equal to an EUA or an EU ETS cost. And there's a few other, transparent criteria. The cost has to be transparent. You have to be able to have an invoice to prove it, yada, yada, yada. But without getting, because we only have maybe 30 minutes here, without getting into too many details, there's actually a lot of very unique criteria. So we work in the hedging realm, right? And so what happens if you hedge your cost? What do I mean by that? Well, if we actually look at tracking the prices of these costs of carbon, how do you interact with them? What if you buy and sell it at various times throughout the year? Which price do you actually incorporate yourself as that effective cost? Because most of our clients in the EU ETS, for example, they're constantly in the market buying and selling. And so if you look at a sophisticated company in Turkey, for example, especially power is very sophisticated. They'll be, continually unwinding their hedges or, going back to the market depending on, in this case, in the EU case at least, clean dark and clean spark spreads throughout the year. And so without getting too technical, it gets really technical really quickly in that regard. And that's why we need an implementing act to clarify a lot of these more minute details regarding the Article 9 effective cost of carbon.
Let's go back to removal. So first, now that I've understood kind of this pricing equivalency, that's probably good news for removals because removals are more expensive. And I guess that then there's less of a competitive advantage of much cheaper reduction credits compared to removals. But what I don't understand yet is why international credits under Article 6. That's a bit I don't understand yet, because let's go back to India because we've been using this example for this conversation. If you have an Indian ETS and you have Indian carbon projects that are somehow integrated into that Indian ETS, that's not really articles. Like Article 6 is to get them with a corresponding adjustment from abroad, right? Or what am I missing? Like, why Article 6?
And further on that, in a lot of cases, the business case to incorporate an Article 6 regime in an effective cost of carbon might be difficult to create. So again, taking a step back, CBAM creates a very, very expensive cost of carbon. It incentivizes third countries to incorporate their own costs of carbon. So, they don't have to send their money to Brussels. They can keep it within their domestic regimes, which is on paper a brilliant incentive. Okay, so if Europe is incentivizing India, for example, to create an effective cost of carbon, India wants that money to stay inside India so India could take it and subsidize industry to make them more competitive for Europe. And if they incorporate an Article 6 regime into their ETS, they might not have control of where that money goes or how they use it. And so a lot of the ministries we work with, for example, they want tight control over the money they get. To give you when we're talking about India, BCG, I can name more than a few sources, are expecting by 2030, India to pay around 1 to 2 billion euros a year in CBAM costs. When I say India, it's not the government, you know what I mean? It's the countries exposed via exporting. The entire VCM market cap's around 2 billion. So you have one country by 2030, their annual exposure to CBAM is 2 billion. If I'm the Ministry of Steel in India, I want some of that money to decarbonize my steel, right? I don't necessarily want it to be going to an Article 6 developer because my lobby, going back to Tata Steel, they're lobbying me because they want to be more competitive to keep going into the European market, and so they need subsidization. And so you get into the economics of CBAM, and all of a sudden, the business case of incorporating anything else except auctionable allowances in a domestic cap and trade market or carbon tax that revenue doesn't go to the ministry, it's hard not to have that business. It's hard to comprehend that business case because a lot of these developing countries we speak with, they desperately need the money to decarbonize their industry because their industry is very uncompetitive now that CBAM arrives. So Indonesia, China, India, Pakistan, Mozambique, I can tell you right now, because we work with a lot of them, their industry is demanding their governments to help them with CBAM via subsidization to decarbonize, which is the result of the end goal of CBAM to begin with, but it kind of incentivizes an auctionable allowance rather than an Article 6 credit for that ETS.
So if you talk about now, like the practical implication, if there would be such guidance from the Commission in this implementing act, and there would be clarity on what kind of schemes, what exactly the equivalence means in practice, is it more likely that the governments in these other countries will want to put in place compliance regimes that grasp the whole value of this, or partially, and so the companies will end up paying partially, like part of the money will stay in their own country and part will still go to the EU because it's not going to be fully equivalent? Like, where do you see the thinking going in these different countries?
So if I had to forecast the next few years, we're going to see a immense rise of very robust costs of carbon. I mean, if I look at I'm not looking at the cost. When you look at, let's say, the South Korean ETS, don't look at the number that you're showing on the exchange, because you have to look at the number net of free allocation, because most of the companies in China, all these places, are not actually paying that. They're only paying a minute. So you take that number and you see the delta between the EU ETS number, because it's not 89 euros, it's really 89 minus net of free allocation. But nevertheless, it's massive. And so what we're going to see is a massive ramp up of all of these developing countries creating genuine carbon markets, not a relative cap, not oversupplied of free allocation, not really small in scale, not covering only a few emissions. No, it's a proper emissions trading system or a carbon tax because of CBAM, and not because they want to. I hate to say it, not because they're tree huggers, because their industry is demanding it. I have a privilege in my role to work on the front lines of a lot of these third countries where they're looking at CBAM not from the lens of their NDC or for climate change. They're looking at it from a competitive, we need to expand our GDP in our industry. We need to have an effective cost of carbon to take that money, subsidize our industry so they can be more competitive in Europe. And then the cool thing is I'm looking far in the future. If we have all these countries and jurisdictions that create their own cost of carbon, what happens? Well, these countries then have carbon leakage. Then what happens? They need a CBAM. They need a BCA. And so you get this domino effect. And I talked about this last time, and I always sound like a broken record, but I mean, these are the conversations I have with our companies and the countries and ministries we work with. This is the future we're going to, and this is what the European Commission wanted. I said something earlier, which is the Commission sees CBAM as somewhat of a success, and I'm sure some of us are going to roll our eyes. We have circumvention issues, we have fertilizer, the whole incident there. But what do we also have? We have the Turkish ministry really doubling down on their ETS. We have China expanding their ETS to all industry and moving from relative to an absolute cap. We have all of this rhetoric coming out of developing countries genuinely looking at effective cost of carbon otherwise without CBAM they might not be. So that's why oftentimes the Commission does see CBAM as a success.
And do you think, because last time when you came on, you also explained quite well how it's not a homogeneous sector like the CBAMs, ETS, there's so many differences between them. Do you feel that the EU can force standardization here through the CBAM?
Yeah,
with that ripple down effect that you described?
So Peter Zeman from HFW created a white paper nearly 3 years ago, and he's actually calling it spot on what the state of play is. And the EU is almost having countries bend to its needs via the CBAM on what they deem a cost of carbon is. And they're doing it quite successfully. if we look at the global sphere, I mean, ICAP, World Bank, they all do great, little images of all the countries you see all around the world with cost of carbon and whatnot. They're all very different in how they actually work and incorporate themselves. One allows offsets, and one is incredibly oversupplied. CBAM is kind of tightening that into what the EU ETS somewhat looks like, which is really expensive and probably not very good news for some countries who are very coal and lignite reliant. But if we're looking at this from a climate change perspective, it does really help the world. I'm going to say something, and I always have people roll my eyes at this, but I'm a firm believer. I mean, I moved from America to Europe because of this. Capitalism got us into this mess, i.e., the Industrial Revolution. Europe is leveraging capitalism to get us out of this mess, i.e., the EU ETS and CBAM. Sebastian, earlier you talked about Yara's $8 billion investment potentially being on hold. That right there is capitalism. It's using a cost of carbon to dictate these really large investments. And that's why I think it's brilliant. Would Yara, and this is actually a testament to CBAM, Yara, without CBAM, wouldn't be spending $8 billion on blue ammonia. That right there, in my eyes, is why I came here from America. I think what the EU is doing here with CBAM and the EU ETS is the blueprint for how we successfully transition industry. It's via a cost of carbon that incentivizes, the marginal abatement cost curve, and that's what we're seeing. And that's why I get very excited to talk about CBAM. I love what I do. Very fortunate because I think it's has merit.
We can see that you love what you do. The optimism, it just comes through. So we have just a couple of minutes left. So where does it leave removals in the end? It sounds like because of the price signal from the EU, we're talking about very robust systems. However, the EU ETS itself today doesn't include removals. We are expecting some removals to play a role in it going forward. I guess some countries will be looking at what the EU will be doing here, but others are moving ahead on their own, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think I see this as a positive space because it's pulling investment into the right direction. Again, take a very small example, but take CCUS. We are speaking actively with a large amount of clients who are actively considering CCUS as a result of CBAM. I mean, I can't name their names, but the amount of companies here, we're talking about large investments based on the business case of CBAM. And so if we look at taking a large pool of money and tossing it at a direction, that's going to create scalability, that's going to create cheaper investments for CCUS, and then later on removals down the road with the technology coming out of that. And as a result of that, we will see a positive move in this space. The highlight of my job at Red Chart Advisors is occasionally we'll get reached out by I don't know, like a graduate at a university job or something, and he has a thesis on some really small niche sustainable topic, decarbonizing clinker, for example. And the only reason they're doing it is because they know there's a payday at the end of it because of CBAM. And so what CBAM's creating is we're creating all of this drive of not just money, but also mental capital of all these folks going into the sector because they know at the end of the day, hey, if you can decarbonize clinker, Chimsa or Teton Cement's going to pay a big check to do so. And so from a water removals element, I think it's quite positive in that realm. It's hard for me to say, yeah, next year we're going to see a big boom in demand for DACs. I can't say that because I'm the CBAM guy, but what I do see is this general direction of investment of mindset is very much looking in the positive way. Earlier, you said, are you bullish on CBAM? I said yes, but I'm also bullish in the climate sphere as a result of CBAM.
So maybe if just a final one to end us off kind of where we started and come full circle. How big do you see the threat to CBAM right now? I mean, there's a lot of camps trying to weaken climate ambition in a lot of different areas, and CBAM is on the chopping block for them. So how do you assess that?
If we have a call in 10 years from now, I can bet my bottom dollar there'll still be member states who will be moaning about the EU ETS and CBAM, and there always will. And you look at the what happened last week. Very very concise overview. Even in the EU's agricultural minister meeting, exactly a week from almost this second, we had member states defending CBAM under fertilizer. Germany came out and straight up said they're not supporting the proposal of fertilizer under Article 27A of CBAM, which is still proposed right now. After that, on Wednesday, we had members of the European Parliament come out again and say that there's significantly strong support in the EPP and other parties proposing not to do this for CBAM. And so from a bird's eye perspective, we do see a lot of people people that matter, I'd say, standing up, not wanting CBAM to get watered down. But if all of this fails and Article 27 passes, that doesn't mean it's going to be used. I know we skipped over this and I only have a minute left. In a 30-second recap, European Commission is proposing a lever, Article 27A. If Article 27A gets approved, which it isn't guaranteed, the European Commission needs certain criteria to even use it. And so that doesn't even mean it's going to get used. I can elaborate much further on what that actually means. Then, last but not least, let's say they use a lever, let's say it's approved, they'd only really ever use it for fertilizer. They're likely not going to use it for any other sectors. So the structure of CBAM is still sound. It's just this one little part of the structure that might not be necessarily 100%. But with that being said, I don't want to ramble too much. I know we're already over time.
Thanks so much. This was great. I think we covered definitely as much as we hoped. Thanks so much for coming back then. We hope that there's going to be another catch-up in the future as well, because these topics will keep being important for us. Also, when we look at things from the removals policy perspective. So thanks so much for joining, and until next time.
Pleasure's mine.
Bye, Dan.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks everyone online.